Well, this is an interesting debate that's online, and I think what you find is that difference between heavy arrows and light arrows and what people are discussing, really, I think, and this goes back to the broadhead debate too, that everyone lose an animal, you blame the broadhead. Lose an animal, arrow, blame the arrow. And now lose an animal, blame the weight of the arrow, that it wasn't good enough. And when really those were all failures of the bow hunter. Had nothing to do, it could have been tracking ability, shot placement, just taking the shot in general, making a bad decision. Those are all on the bow hunter. Those have nothing to do with the equipment. So a lot of times we're failing as bow hunters and we're using equipment as an excuse. That's human nature, right? That happens all the time. In 2010, I had a really bad year, and so I remember I'd shot mechanical broadheads for 15 years. I shot a certain kind of sight for probably a decade, and certain kind of arrows, certain kind of release. And I changed everything that year because I had so many failures and it had nothing to do with the equipment. It just made me feel a lot more confident going into the next year for using some different equipment. And so I wanted to discuss the heavy versus light arrow debate, and kind of brought me up, Dylan was at an archery store and archery shop, pro shop, and someone came in because they said they wanted a heavy arrow setup. And it's interesting, he was like, Dylan saw, what did the owner say, or the bow tech?
Well, he came in and he had just watched a YouTube video, and that's why he wanted to come in and get completely new arrow setup. And so the guy behind the counter basically said, like, well, I can help you out, but that's not what I would recommend using.
Right, and I think kind of talk about extremities, and what I've seen is kind of a similar circumstance with the different pro shops that I'm familiar with around the country that are high-end pro shops, because they're looking at everything. They see losses, they see gains, they hear a lot of stories of, hey, I just did this and I need to do this to make up for it. I need this to better my equipment or whatever it is. But in most things in life, if you look at the extremes, obviously, let's just talk 1,000 grain arrow versus 100. I wouldn't want to shoot either for many reasons. For one, the 1,000 grain arrow, you're trying to shoot something at 20 yards. If you're off 3 yards and you're guessing, you could be off 8 inches on target. So that's a little bit too much room for there's not much room for error in a situation like that. So I don't want that with that 1,000. Then a 100 grain arrow, it just seems like impossible. To be honest, I'd probably pick the 100 grain arrow over the 1,000, but I'm not even sure. I've never shot something at light. I've actually shot something in the high 200s and killed a lot of deer with it, but never that light. And I've shot deer at well over 600 grain, 650 grain arrows. If you look up the weight of a 29-inch 2317 with 150 grain broadhead on it, those old Game Getter 2 arrows back in the day, or Autumn Olive, Autumn Orange, whatever they had from Easton. Those arrows back in the day, there's some really 2317 is a very heavy arrow. And shot some deer and a bear with those two. So going back a long ways, between this heavy and light arrow debate, I want you that are, just coming at this, because people have their opinions. I know guys that shoot low 300 arrow weight and they're shooting 70 pounds. And so they're shooting extremely flat trajectory and they really like that. I know guys that shoot really heavy arrows and they like that too. I'll always preach for balance, something in between. And I think that's very critical. I'm going to look at some of the absolutes, but one of the things that's not an absolute, the heavy arrow debate has been around for just 2 or 3 years. It hasn't been for a really long time. And so it's interesting, I'll have people even comment on YouTube. They'll say, well, I've been using this setup for 3 years and every deer I've shot has been a pass-through. Well, I can talk about that with deer that for 15 years, I didn't have a pass-through, maybe 2 out of 40 deer. They always went through. Because you shoot them in the right spot and you shoot them with a good combination, you know your limits, and you take good shots, it's going to go through, majority of the time. And so someone will say, yeah, for 3 years, all 2 of my deer, or 3 deer, or 4 deer, it's gone through. That doesn't mean much. And so it's interesting how people point that out, like that's an accomplishment. How about decades of experience using different arrow setups, and bring that to the table. I like when I hear on the YouTube video, someone will say, I've been doing this for 40 years. This is what's really worked for me. You have to stop and think about that. Man, 40 years. Because I've been bow hunting for about 36. This will be my 35th, 36th season, somewhere around 37th, somewhere around there. And you start to think, man, somebody has 40, somebody has 50 years. I want to listen to what they say, because they've experienced a whole bunch of stuff. But someone who's had a certain experience of a certain kind of arrow setup for a couple of years, does it really mean much? So it's kind of almost laughable. But number one, this is an absolute. It is unethical if you're aiming at bone with your heavy arrow, with your light arrow. And you can make a case that the right light arrow setup will penetrate more. We'll talk about Joel Maxfield here in a second from Matthews Archery. He's done some great tests. And he's had tests where it shows a heavy arrow bouncing off a PVC plate versus a light arrow smashing right through and penetrating on the other side. And so tweaking with those. But bottom line is that neither should be shooting a heavy bone. And there's people out there actually preaching to just aim for the shoulder, or if it's quartering towards your shot, just go ahead and do it. And that couldn't be further from the truth. That is, again, very unethical to do that. And it's unfortunate there's people talking about that online, just shoot for the bone. And like Dylan pointed out, we had a discussion earlier that a lot of people are shooting a deer in the shoulder and they really didn't hit any bone. The way the shoulder is curved, they're hitting straight lungs, or it's going in, hitting the bone on the opposite side, stopping. It looks like it had great penetration. And it really didn't. It looked like it hit shoulder. And then, Dylan, what were you saying about a shoulder earlier? If someone says they shot through a shoulder?
Show me the hole in the bone and show me the arrow on the other side. That's what I'd like to see, to actually believe it.
Oh, especially with like the socket and the actual ridge of the bone. There's a lot of bone to go through that someone might get lucky with the right setup, but the proof is in the pudding, and you rarely see big heavy bone out there with a split going through it and the broadhead out the other side. And I'm not saying they're not out there, but the bottom line is you should never take that shot on purpose with a light arrow that you think penetrates more, or a heavy arrow that penetrates more. That's an absolute. Both are overkill for deer. By many pounds, by many years ago, are overkill for deer. Probably expand that to elk, bear. Most deer hunting setups are overkill. And you could even drop that down. Today's 40-pound bow was equal to a 60-pound bow 20 years ago. 60 pounds is fine then. 40 pounds on today's modern bow should be fine now. A lot of that has to do because more energy is being transferred to the arrow. The efficiency of the bow is such that you can actually have a bow that has less stored energy, but it actually transfers a higher percentage of that energy to the arrow, so that the bow is actually quieter, more accurate. It's lighter on equipment, doesn't break things, vibrate things, feels good in the hand when you shoot, has that dull thud when you shoot it, and it's because more energy is being transferred, there's less stored energy. Where back in the day, a lot of bows blew up. I can remember that back in the 90s, the late 80s. A lot of people were pushing the speed envelope, using overdraws, and bows blow up. And that's not the case today. But when it comes to, I used to shoot I've shot up to 94 pounds on an old PSE, but even a bow that I would shoot at 75 pounds is equal to a bow at 55 pounds today, shooting the same arrow, same speed, same kinetic energy. So there's been huge advancements in bows, which makes a big difference over the years. The bottom line is, think about that. 30 years ago, someone shooting an 80-pound bow, it seemed like, wow, that's impressive. But really, that's equal to about a 58-pound, 62-pound bow in today's times. And so we still have people shooting 70, 80 pounds, and it's complete overkill for what you need. And it can actually be damaging for your joints long term. And I want to shoot archery till, shoot vertical bows till I'm 80. If something happens to my shoulders, my elbows, or something my back, where I couldn't pull a bow, I'll go hunt with a crossbow. I have no problems admitting that. I don't want to not bow hunt, but I'm going to use vertical bow hunt till I physically can't, or vertical bow to hunt till I physically can't. Nothing wrong with you if you shoot a crossbow to me. Know your setup. Both of them, you have to know your setup. What I mean is, and this gets us into number 4, but you have to know how much your arrow drops from 25 to 30, 30 to 35. Common bow hunting range, because that's another thing. Today's bow hunting, today's modern bows, you can shoot out to 35 yards, 40 yards very, very accurately, a lot more accurately than you could bows 20 years ago at 20 yards. So very easy to shoot long distance, and they're not that far off. Guys are shooting deer at 80 yards, 70 yards, mule deer out west, antelope, and they're taking long shots because the bow is capable of doing so. And it doesn't matter if it's a light or heavy arrow at that point. It's a dead animal if you hit them in the sweet spot. And the sweet spot is this big. It's not, this little window that you have to hit this 2-inch hole at 60 yards. We're talking a 10-inch or 12-inch area that you can hit and still be very proficient. So you have to know your setup, know how much. People worry so much about penetration. Who cares about that? Your kinetic energy, who cares about that? I'll point this out. Kinetic energy wise, do you guys realize on a 200 grain difference, you're only gaining 3%, approximately 3% gain in kinetic energy for a arrow that's 200 grains heavier? That's all you're getting. On top of that, a heavier arrow, you're going to lose about 30% in trajectory, overall trajectory out to 40 yards. We did an interesting test a while back, and bottom line is I could care really less what you shoot, just know your setup. But we did a test a while back, Dylan and I, where we were shooting a difference of 30 to 34 yards, I think, Dylan, or was it 30 to 36?
Yeah, something like that.
30, 35, right around there. But we found that there was about a 4-inch drop with the lighter setup from 30 to 35 yards. We found there's a 7-inch drop. There's actually a 3-inch drop. There's a 3-inch drop in that distance with a 200 grain less arrow. And there's actually a 7-inch drop with the heavy arrow. We did that just to show that trajectory matters. It comes down, you gotta know your setup, but trajectory kills too. What I mean by that is if you're experiencing a 7-inch loss over a 4 or 5 yard distance, that's a great loss per yard, as opposed to 3 inches per 5 yards, whatever it might be. Hey, you might go down a 3/4 inch, because when we aim at animals, we're not exactly sure where we're aiming. We try to pick a spot, pick a little tuft of hair, and we aim and we shoot. But there's a lot of things going on in a tree stand. And so we need a window, we need a gray area. And I want that gray area. I want that gray area in trajectory. I want balance. And that's number 5. Balance is key. I really like a balanced arrow. And that's what brings me up to Joel Maxfield. And Joel Maxfield's killed big game animals all around the world. He's one of the few that have killed all North American big game species, let alone a lot of African game too. All the sheep varieties. He's killed them all with a bow. He uses a very balanced arrow setup. I don't quote me on this, but it's around 500 grains. He shoots in the low 70s, 72 pounds, somewhere around there, 70 pounds. So where I'm shooting about 62 pounds, I'm shooting a 430 grain arrow, 440 grains right around there. And so really balanced per pound if you look at that. And so, but he does a lot of studies online on Facebook. He's the original employee at Matthews, he's a very smart dude, and he spends a lot of time studying this. He studies momentum, which is a lot different too. Momentum actually can measure the amount of the stored energy versus what is actually portrayed downfield, downrange into a target. Everyone looks at kinetic energy, trajectory, but momentum is another aspect of this too. And what you find is that back in the day, you needed a heavy bow because the bows were so inefficient that the stored energy was not all transferred to the arrow. In fact, it was a very low percentage was actually transferred to the bow. And then of course, stick bows, recurves, they're really bad. And you get into their early compounds, they're pretty bad. Today's bows, though, modern bows from most of the major manufacturers are very efficient. I use a Matthews. I believe they are the most efficient as far as transferring energy to the arrow with the physics they use for the bows. But bottom line is that all the bows now are great at delivering a high level of efficiency. With bad bow setups, you needed a heavy arrow to harness that power that was stored energy in the bow. That's not true of today, not at all. And so there's a big difference with today's modern setups, and that's an absolute. But check out Joel Maxfield. I urge you, people that are on the fence of using a lighter arrow, using a heavy arrow, whatever you want to do, just look up Joel Maxfield on Facebook, and he's got some really cool studies. He puts a lot of time and energy into that. And he's someone that he's just looking at it from a perspective of, I want to kill deer around the world. I want to kill animals around the world. and I want the most efficient setup that helps me do so, that's all he's coming at it with. And you'll notice that a lot of people are looking at that from that level of experience. You know, Joel is one of the most experienced archers that I know around the world. You look at whitetail hunters that have killed deer for 30 years plus consistently, several a year. You know, those are experienced archers. And what's interesting, whether it's pro shops, experienced archers, you'll find a common theme through all of this, what they use. Bottom line is, balance is key, and it doesn't matter what you use. Know your limitations. If you are going to use a heavy arrow setup because you choose it and think that it penetrates better for some reason, then you should know how much it drops per yard from at least 25 yards out. You know, 25 to 20, even with a fast modern bow at 280 feet a second, is going to drop about 2 inches, just from 20 to 25. So when someone says online, I use the same pin out to 40 and it shoots flat, that discounts them as a bow hunter right off the bat. They lack any credibility, because that's not possible with today's modern setups even. But even from 20 to 25, you drop a couple inches. 25 to 30, you drop 3.5, 4 inches. When you get up around 40 yards, you're dropping 1.25 inches at 280 feet a second with most setups, even efficient setups. So when you use that heavy arrow, you need to know that your arrow is dropping from 30 to 35, 7 inches, or 30 to 34, 7 inches, that you're dropping 2 inches. At the same time, you need to know if you're shooting that ultra fast bow that you can't just go out and use one pin out to 35 yards. Yeah, if you hold over or hold under, you can, but it's not flat enough. It's not like a gun. So both have limitations from both sides. The bottom line is they're both overkill, and they're both great setups. And to me, balance is always better. You know, I want to experience that trajectory, because I want to shoot out to 30, 35 yards and not have to worry about being to the yard or I'm 2 inches off. Because a lot of the heavy arrows, if they're 35 yards, if you're shooting at something around then, literally if you're off a yard, you're going to be off about 2 inches. And in today's modern bows, accuracy-wise, are capable of shooting that distance, so why shortchange yourself? At the same time, you need to know that if you're shooting a really fast setup, that you can't just hold one pin and shoot it. The trajectory is so flat that you're going to hit anything. You know, I used to shoot, it was a 290 grain arrow, 57 grain Wolverine broadhead. It was a Easton ACCs. They were ACC 100s, Carbon Express 100s. I used for a long time. I also used the ACCs. It was a 318 I used, a very light arrow, set up with a 57 grain. Used the Carbon Express 100s. We're going back a long ways, into the mid 90s, and for that flatter trajectory out of slower bows back then. And I always had pass-throughs, because if you hit them in the lungs, they go out the other side and stick in the dirt. I've blown through a shoulder. Through the shoulder blade, not the ridge, not the socket, but the blade portion that you could almost ram a field point through in most situations. I wouldn't, obviously that's illegal to use a field point for bow hunting, but bottom line is that 57 grain Wolverine would go right through it on a 193 pound field dress deer. That doesn't mean that I can expect to shoot through bone. I need to know my limitations. Both are highly capable of deer at your setup. Just know, whether it's light or heavy, the limitations. Go out into the woods with confidence, and don't spend so much time debating arrows and weight of arrows online that you lose sight of actually putting hunting strategy into your hunt this fall, and hunting with a high level of hunting strategy. I would spend a lot more time on that. Just get out, shoot, make sure you're accurate, and head to the woods with confidence, because you know that you've applied actual hunting strategy to your hunt this year, instead of worrying about how heavy your arrow is or not. Folks, I want to make sure you check out my web class video series, whether it's how to design your food plot program or how to design your property in general. And we have a new one coming out that'll be how to hunt the rut. But these bucks back here are a testament. Some of these bucks go back to 93. They're even in different states. I urge you to check out those web classes so that you can help yourself, help your land, help your hunt. The link is in the description. And also for those that have tried them out, I encourage you to offer some feedback in the comments below. Thank you.